I feel really bad for Chicago Bears fans. Um, I don't feel bad for the Chicago Bears. It's a really weird distinction. I think the Chicago Bears are kind of one of those teams. They're kind of like the Dallas Cowboys. They're kind of like the San Francisco 49ers. They're kind of like, not to the same exact extent, but they're kind of like Pittsburgh Steelers fans. I don't think Pittsburgh is to the same exact extent. I think the Chicago Bears are one of those teams where there's probably more fans outside of the city of Chicago. Like the ratio of fans outside of the city of Chicago compared to the city of Chicago liking the Chicago Bears. There's probably more fans outside of Chicago and outside of Illinois than there are inside of the state and inside of the city. And that's because the way that this front office has managed this team over the last decade, spanning from the end of the Jay Cutler era until now, it is easily the worst decade-long stretch of a front office putting together a roster. And this is multiple front offices at this point now with what they are doing within these last few months with the new regime, and then before when they had Ryan Pace. And it's just it's not just terrible, it's flat out the worst job that has been done in the NFL. Somehow the Chicago Bears, because of the fact that they play in probably the worst division in football in the NFC North, they avoided being the worst team in their division last year, with the Detroit Lions coming in 3-13-1. The Bears winning 6 games last year, 2 of them against Detroit, 1 against Vegas, 1 against Seattle, 1 against New York, and 1 against Cincinnati. Apparently, Justin Fields is the guy in Chicago, but they have not made a single move that would actually signal to you, oh yeah, they fully believe in Justin Fields and they're going to bring him along with this new era of this football team. Let's just name off some names that are featured on this roster at skill position. The wide receivers. Your number 1 paid receiver on the team is Byron Pringle. They follow that up with N'Keal Harry, Velus Jones, Darnell Mooney, who's a really good player, Equanimeous St. Brown, Nsimba Webster, David Moore, who I like, Dante Pettis, Tajay Sharp, Isaiah Coulter, Daz Newsome. Not a single name that you would look at and say, oh yeah, that's a number 1 receiver. You wouldn't even look at any of one of these guys and say that's a number 3 or a number 4 on any solid depth chart. In the cases of Equanimeous St. Brown, N'Keal Harry, Byron Pringle, David Moore, Dante Pettis, Tajay Sharp, Isaiah Coulter, all of these guys are guys who were drafted by somebody else and who are still on the first version of their contracts, to where they could have been let go for nothing. They were let go for nothing, and now they are in Chicago. And it's like all of these guys who did nothing with the team they were drafted by, and now they're all in Chicago, and they're probably all going to do nothing in Chicago. It doesn't get much better at the tight end position. Ryan Griffin, Cole Kmet, James O'Shaughnessy. Like, it's such a weak skill position group that you almost have nothing to do but bet against Justin Fields this year. And if you're the Chicago Bears front office, you almost have nothing to do but hope that he just doesn't get injured, because the offensive line isn't necessarily the greatest either. You're looking at a starting lineup for the offensive line that's probably going to look something like Cody Whitehair, Riley Reiff, Lucas Patrick, and then whoever you want to fill in the blanks with between Michael Schofield, Tevin Jenkins, Larry Borum, Julian Davenport, who is probably the worst left tackle I've ever seen play in my entire fucking life, Sam Mustipher, Lachavious Simmons. It's such a bad offense that, like I said, you have nothing to do but hope that Justin Fields doesn't get injured. The defense doesn't get much better either. I mean, Robert Quinn, they're still paying him $17 million a year. There's reports that Roquan Smith apparently wants out because the front office doesn't value him. Somehow the guy who has the 3rd most tackles in the NFL since he entered the league is unvaluable to this franchise. And this is not the first, like, Roquan Smith is not the first guy that this has happened to in Chicago over these last 10 years, like I said. There's been so many names that have come through this team since 2012 that you're like, how is this team at 6-11 in 2021? If you want to go and just look at the Bears draft decisions that they've made, there's actually some picks that you look at and you're like, wow, that's a really good pick. Let's just start in 2012, right? I mean, this is something I've done before on this channel where I've looked at all of the picks. But like, you look at the selections for this team, you have really good names. You have Kyle Fuller, you have Adrian Amos, you have Cody Whitehair, you have Leonard Floyd, you have Mitch Trubisky, who I think got a really raw deal in Chicago. But you have Eddie Jackson, you have Tariq Cohen, you have Roquan Smith, James Daniels, Anthony Miller. You have so many really good names, and that's not even getting into the last few years. But they not only compound the problem of letting go all the good players that they draft, they supplement that by keeping the really bad players that they draft as well. And the players that just don't fit into what the roster needs. This team has drafted tight end after tight end after tight end. None of them have ever worked out for this team. Cole Kmet, Adam Shaheen, who I really loved Adam Shaheen coming out of college, out of Ashland, but he wasn't worth a second-round pick like where he got drafted. Cole Kmet, he wasn't worth a second-round pick where he got drafted, and he has been nowhere near worth a second-round pick since he's been drafted. The best pick they've had in the last 5 years is Darnell Mooney in the 5th round. I mean, really, when you compare, like, value to what he's actually brought to the team, the only guy who looks like he's going to be on the roster for the next few years is Darnell Mooney. We don't know about Justin Fields yet. We don't know about anybody else that they drafted. And they supplement the fact that they're terrible at drafting. They're terrible at keeping the good players that they draft. They sign guys to really terrible contracts. I referenced the Robert Quinn contract. They signed Robert Quinn to a $100 million deal the same year that they let Leonard Floyd walk. Like, they make these decisions that are so terrible, they're so bad, and honestly, this year is looking worse than it did last year. I think last year there was at least a hope that was like, man, we could be like a 6-7 win team, and they were exactly that, a 6-win team. They looked terrible the entire year to the point where it's a surprise they even won 6 games. If their schedule was not as weak as it was last year, they would not have won 6 games. They got bailed out by the fact that they got to play Detroit twice. And look, I hate to do this, and I hate to say this, but it's just that Chicago has the worst front office in the NFL. They have the worst management in the NFL. They have one of the worst coaching staffs in the NFL, even though I think that Matt Eberflus was the best coaching hire over this offseason. I think anytime the best player on your team, and the best player on this team right now is probably Roquan Smith, right? The guy who's produced the most between him or Eddie Jackson. If he's falling out with your front office and your coaching staff already, and it's been like 3 months that this team has been together, there's an obvious issue there. There's a really big issue there. And now it's looking like he's not going to be there. At least after this year, I would guarantee that Roquan Smith is going to be gone. We haven't even seen him hold out yet. And I just think it just doesn't make sense to see what they've done. And it doesn't make sense to hear them say things like, we know what we're doing. We are putting the best interests possible around Justin Fields, when they obviously aren't doing that. With so many receivers who were available this year, with so many receivers who got traded or were signed or were drafted this year, the Chicago Bears didn't get a single one of them that we thought was a quality guy. And look, it's sad to see, because I think Justin Fields could develop into something, but he's not going to be able to do it in Chicago. And with the way it's going right now, we're looking at a strong possibility that the Chicago Bears are going to have their second straight high first-round draft pick quarterback flame out in the NFL with that team before he even gets a chance to show how good he can be.